The last time Claire had tried to talk to her mother about it, she'd been 31. That had been 4 years ago at Thanksgiving, which was the wrong place and the wrong time, and she'd known both of those things and done it anyway. Because that was what happened when you held something for too long. It stopped waiting for the right moment and started looking for any moment. She remembered standing in the kitchen doorway while her mother arranged the good dishes on the counter and saying, not loudly, not dramatically, just saying, "I need you to explain it to me, Mom. I need you to explain why you didn't tell me." And her mother, Diane, had set down the plate she was holding and turned and looked at Claire with an expression that Claire had catalogued many times over the years without being able to fully decode it. Something between sorrow and wariness. The look of a person who has braced for a door that keeps opening. "Claire," she'd said, "we've talked about this. We've talked around it. I don't know what you want me to say." "The truth," Claire had said. "That's the one thing I've been asking for." And Diane had picked up the plate again and said quietly, "I've told you what I can tell you." And Claire had walked out of the kitchen and driven home early, and they hadn't spoken properly for 6 weeks. That was the shape of it. That was how it went. The thing itself had happened when Claire was 19. Her parents had been having problems, serious ones, not the ambient low-grade tension she'd grown up understanding was part of their marriage, but something more concentrated. Her father, Richard, had done something. Claire knew the outline of it. She'd been in college her first year, and she'd come home for spring break to find the house carrying a specific kind of quiet, the kind that meant people had been arguing and had stopped, not because the argument was over, but because there was a child in the house. Except she wasn't a child. She was 19. She'd said so. Her mother hadn't disagreed. She'd just said that there were some things between parents that stayed between parents, and that everything was being handled, and that Claire didn't need to carry any of this. Claire had gone back to school. The marriage had survived, or something like it. Her parents had stayed together for 9 more years, until her father's death, and Claire had never gotten the full story of what had happened that spring. She'd asked. She'd been redirected. She'd grown older and the asking had become harder, and then she'd stopped asking and started resenting the silence instead, which was easier to maintain. She'd built a theory. Everyone builds a theory when information is withheld. The mind fills the space with whatever fits. Claire's theory was that her mother had chosen to protect the marriage over protecting Claire, that Diane had prioritized keeping things intact over telling her daughter the truth, and that this was cowardice dressed up as discretion. It was a complete theory. It explained the silence. It explained the wariness in Diane's face. It explained everything. It just turned out to be wrong. Claire found out she was wrong on a Tuesday in March, when she was 35, in her mother's house, going through a filing cabinet. Diane was in the hospital. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but a fall, a suspected fracture, a few days of tests and observation, and the particular indignity of being 71 and suddenly subject to the concern of nurses and daughters. She'd called Claire herself from the hospital because that was the kind of thing you did when you were 71 and had one daughter, whatever the state of your relationship. Claire had driven up. She'd organized herself in Diane's house, which she hadn't spent more than a night in for the better part of 2 years. She'd handled the things Diane had asked her to handle, called the doctor's office, canceled an appointment, fed the cat. And then she'd been looking for the insurance information, which Diane had said was in the 3rd drawer of the filing cabinet in the study, and it was there. And next to it was a folder that said, in her mother's handwriting, "Richard, legal." She hadn't planned to open it. She stood holding it for a long moment. The cat came and sat next to her feet and looked up at her with the impartial attention of cats. She opened it. There were papers inside that she hadn't known existed. Legal documents, correspondence. A letter from an attorney that was dated the May after that spring break, so 16 years ago, using language that was careful and formal and unmistakable in its meaning. Claire read it twice. Then she sat down on the floor of her mother's study and read it again. Her father had not simply been unfaithful, which was what she'd always assumed. There was more to it. Money. Not a small amount. An account that her mother had not known about. A person outside the marriage who had been involved in more than one way. The letter was part of a confidential negotiation that had involved, apparently, significant legal exposure and an agreement that protected the family assets and required, as a condition, non-disclosure. Non-disclosure. Claire sat there with the papers in her hands for a long time. There was another document in the folder, smaller, not a legal document, a letter in her mother's handwriting, undated, addressed to no one. The kind of thing you write when you need to write something and don't know where to send it. If I tell her, she carries this about her father for the rest of her life. She idolizes him. He is not here to explain himself or to apologize to her. She gets only the damage, none of the repair. I made the choice to keep this from her, and I am keeping it. And I know what it costs, and I know what she thinks of me for it. I know what I look like. I'd rather she think I was weak than spend her life looking at him the way I've had to. Claire put the letter down on the floor next to her. Outside, a car went past on the street. The cat, apparently deciding nothing interesting was happening, walked to the other side of the room and settled in a patch of sunlight. Her father had died 7 years ago. Heart. Relatively sudden, not much warning. Claire had been with him at the end. She'd held his hand. She'd cried at his funeral in the specific way that you cry when someone dies who was complicated, who you loved, and who wasn't simple. And she'd believed in that grief that whatever had happened between her parents had been her mother's fault at least as much as his. She'd believed her mother had chosen badly, made the accommodating choice, traded honesty for stability. She'd been wrong. And also, in some way she was only beginning to understand, not entirely wrong. Her mother had protected her, and the protection had cost her 16 years of her daughter's full trust. Diane had known that. She'd written it down. I know what it costs. If you've ever had the ground reorganize itself under a belief you've been standing on for a very long time, you know what the next hour felt like for Claire. It isn't clean. It isn't a simple flip from one thing to another. It's more like finding out that the map you've been using is accurate in some places and wrong in others, and you can't yet tell which roads are real. She put the folder back in the cabinet. She sat in her mother's study until the light changed. Then she drove to the hospital. If a story about the distance between people and the things they don't say is landing somewhere close right now, stay with this one. And if this channel is where you come for that kind of story, subscribe. There's more here. Diane was in a room on the 3rd floor. She looked smaller in a hospital bed, which everyone does, and she was wearing a gown that was too large for her, and she had a book open on her lap that she wasn't reading. She looked up when Claire came in. "How was the house?" she asked. "Fine," Claire said. "Cat's fed. I found the insurance card." "Good." Diane looked at her for a moment. "You look pale." "I'm fine." She pulled the chair up to the side of the bed and sat down. They were quiet for a moment. There was a television in the corner of the room, muted, showing a talk show. A nurse went past in the hallway. "Mom," Claire said, "I found the folder." Diane was still for a moment. She closed the book in her lap. She looked at the window, not at Claire. "The one in the filing cabinet," Claire said, "with Dad's name on it." Diane didn't say anything. "I wasn't looking for it," Claire said. "I was looking for the insurance paperwork." She paused. "I read what was in it, the legal documents, and the letter you wrote." Very slowly, Diane turned to look at her. Claire couldn't identify the expression on her mother's face. It wasn't fear exactly. It wasn't relief either, though there was something in the vicinity of relief. It was the expression of a person who has been waiting for a door to open for a very long time and is not sure yet whether they want it open. "Claire," she said, Why didn't you tell me? Diane looked at her hands for a moment. Then she said, You've asked me that question for 16 years. And now I've read your answer. Then you know why. I know what you wrote. Claire's voice was steady. She was working to keep it steady. I want to hear you say it. Diane was quiet. Outside in the hallway, someone's phone rang and was quickly silenced. He was your father, Diane said finally. He loved you. Whatever else he was, and he was more than that, Claire. He was more than one thing. He loved you completely. I knew that. I knew that if I told you what had happened, if I told you all of it, you would be angry, and you would have every right to be angry. And he wasn't there to answer for it. He couldn't explain himself. He couldn't make it right with you. She paused. People who are gone can't repair anything. They just leave the damage, and the people who are still there try to manage it. Claire said nothing. I thought, Diane said slowly, that you deserved to keep the father you had, the one you knew, the one who taught you to drive and came to every school thing and cried at your college graduation. She looked at Claire directly. I thought protecting that was the right thing. She stopped. I don't know anymore whether it was the right thing, but it was what I chose. You chose to let me blame you instead. Diane was quiet for a moment. Yes, for 16 years. Yes. Claire looked at her mother. 71 years old, in a hospital gown that didn't fit, with a suspected fracture and a book she wasn't reading, and 16 years of having been wrong in her daughter's eyes without contesting it. Why didn't you just tell me he was the problem? Claire asked. Not everything, not the details, but why did you let me think you were? Because you loved him, Diane said simply. And children should be able to love their parents, even when their parents don't deserve it completely. It was a difficult thing to argue with. That was the thing about it. Claire had spent the drive to the hospital organizing herself for some kind of confrontation, preparing the words she was going to say, and now she was sitting in this fluorescent room and finding that the confrontation she'd prepared for was not the one she was in. Her mother hadn't been weak. Her mother had made a calculation, a painful one, an arguably wrong one that had cost both of them something significant. But it hadn't come from weakness. It had come from a set of priorities that Claire had never been shown, because she hadn't been shown the situation that produced them. That was the complicated part. She was allowed to be angry about the silence. She was. The silence had been real, and its cost had been real. And the fact that the silence had come from protection rather than cowardice didn't erase 16 years of cold space between them. It shifted something, but it didn't erase things. She thought about her father. She thought about the way he'd looked at her graduation. Diane had been right about that. He had cried, actually cried, her steady, competent father. And she'd teased him gently about it, and he'd waved her off and cried a little more. She thought about the fact that this was all still true, that it existed alongside everything else, that a person could be two things at once, capable of both great love and serious damage, and that her father had apparently been both, and she'd only ever been allowed to see one half. She didn't know how to feel about her father right now. That was honest. She didn't know how to feel about her mother either. Also honest. I'm angry, Claire said. I know, said Diane. Not for the reason I've been angry all this time, but still. I know that too. You should have told me eventually. He's been gone 7 years. You could have told me after he died. Diane looked at the window. I know. I thought about it. I didn't know how to. She shook her head. I didn't know how to give you something that big with no way to make it better. And I'd held it for so long that I didn't know how to put it down. There it was. The other side of it, not only protection, but also the way a secret becomes part of a person over time, becomes structural, becomes harder to release the longer it's carried. Diane had protected Claire at 19, and then hadn't known how to undo the protection at 25, or 30, or 35. And in the meantime, Claire had built her anger on the wrong foundation, and Diane had lived inside the understanding that she'd traded her daughter's trust for her daughter's image of her father. Nobody had gotten a good deal. The nurse came in to check Diane's blood pressure, and they were both quiet while she did it. The particular quiet of two people who have entered a room that neither of them knows how to leave yet. The nurse said everything looked fine and went back out. "I don't know what to do with this," Claire said. She meant it practically, which was sometimes the most honest way to mean things. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it." "You don't have to do anything with it today," Diane said. "I know." Claire looked at her hands. "I've been thinking about you a certain way for a long time." "I know that, too. It's going to take a while to—" She didn't finish the sentence. "Claire?" Her mother's voice was careful, quiet. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm not asking you to feel a certain way or forgive anything or decide anything. I just—" She stopped. "I'm sorry that the silence hurt you. I knew it would. I chose it anyway. That was a decision I made, and it was mine to make, and I could be wrong about it. Maybe I was wrong about it." She looked at Claire. "But it wasn't because I didn't think about you. It was because I thought about you too much." Claire sat there. The muted talk show changed to something else. Outside, the afternoon light was flattening toward evening. She thought about driving home tonight versus staying. She thought about the filing cabinet with the folder in it. She thought about the letter in her mother's handwriting, the one that had been sitting in that drawer for 16 years without being sent anywhere. "I know what I look like. I'd rather she think I was weak." "I'm going to stay tonight," Claire said. "At the house." "You don't have to." "I know." She stayed. She went back to the house, fed the cat again, made herself dinner, and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water for a long time, not doing much. She called her friend Beth and talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular because she needed the sound of a normal conversation. She went to bed early and didn't sleep well, and lay in the dark of her mother's guest room going through the same territory in her head from different directions. What she kept returning to was the letter. "I know what I look like." Diane had known. She'd always known what Claire thought of her, or had been able to guess, and she had chosen, year after year, to absorb it. She'd sat through Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas calls, and the particular stiffness of a daughter who was present but not quite there. And she hadn't defended herself. She'd held the thing she could have used to defend herself, and she'd kept holding it. That was either a profound act of love or a profound failure of honesty, and Claire was too tired and too unsettled to know yet which one it was. Maybe both. She suspected both. She fell asleep around 2 in the morning. In the morning, she went back to the hospital with coffee and the book her mother had left behind. Diane was sitting up in bed, looking somewhat more like herself. The doctor had come by earlier, and the fracture was confirmed, but minor, and she would be discharged in 2 days. "How did you sleep?" Diane asked. "Okay," Claire said, which was nearly true. She sat down and handed over the coffee. They were quiet for a moment. The morning had a different quality than the evening before. Not easier, but more open somehow. The way things feel after a night has passed over them. "I need to ask you something," Claire said. "Okay." "When I was angry at you, all those years, did you ever want to just tell me? To explain?" Diane looked at her coffee. "Every time," she said. "Every time you looked at me the way you looked at me sometimes. Why didn't you?" Because the moment I explained, you'd have spent the rest of your life carrying something about your father that I'd put down in front of you. And then he'd be gone, and you'd have nowhere to put it. She paused. I carried it for both of us. I thought that was better. I might have been wrong. Might have been was doing some work in that sentence. Claire noted it without pressing it. She thought about her father differently now, not as the father she'd had, and also not as the version implied by the legal documents. Somewhere in between. A person who had done something serious and also spent years afterwards as a good father, which were both true and didn't cancel each other out. People were capable of that combination, and it didn't make either part less real. She was going to have to hold two versions of him now, which was harder than one. And she was going to have to hold two versions of her mother, too. The one she'd built over 16 years, and the one who had been sitting in a study somewhere writing letters she never sent, knowing what she looked like and accepting it because the alternative was worse. I want to ask you something while we're in the middle of this. Not at the end of it, right in the middle. What would you have done? If you were Diane, if you had that information and that choice, would you have told? Would you have stayed quiet? Leave a comment. Not a judgment, just what do you think you'd actually do? Claire stayed for 3 days while her mother was discharged and settled back into the house. They didn't have another big conversation about it. They talked around it and through it, the way you talk around something large when you're still deciding how close you want to stand to it. They talked about the practical things, Diane's recovery, the follow-up appointments, whether she should consider railing for the back steps, which had been loose for 2 years. They talked about Claire's work, about a trip Diane had been planning before the fall. They talked, one evening, about Richard. Not about what Claire had found, but just about him, about specific memories, and it was a strange conversation because some of those memories were shifting slightly in their meaning, and Claire wasn't always sure what she felt as she recalled them. She felt love. That was still there. Also anger. Also grief. Also something she didn't have a word for exactly. The particular sadness of learning that a person was more complicated than you knew, and that the complication can't be addressed because the person isn't there anymore. She left on a Saturday morning. She and Diane stood at the front door, and Diane looked steadier than she had in the hospital, more like herself, and Claire hugged her. Not the careful hug of recent years, the one calibrated to appropriate warmth without excess, just a hug. Her mother's hand pressed against her back for a moment. "Drive safe," Diane said. "I will." Claire got in her car. She sat for a moment before starting it, looking at the front of the house she'd grown up in, the loose step on the front porch that had apparently never been fixed in 30 years. She thought about her mother inside, settling back into the quiet of a house she lived in alone. She thought about 16 years, about the specific loneliness of being misread by someone you love, and choosing to let it continue rather than cause a different kind of pain. She didn't know yet whether she thought her mother had been right. She genuinely didn't know. There was an argument for it. There was also an argument that the truth, given gently, at the right time, after enough distance from the original wound, was always better than the lie of omission, however kind the intention. She'd been kept from a truth about her own family, and that had a cost. And the cost had been real, and the good intentions behind it didn't fully erase that. But she also, and this was new, this was what the last 3 days had done. She saw her mother as a person now, more fully than she had before. Not a villain in her story, and not a saint either. A person who had faced an impossible set of options and chosen the one that seemed least damaging to someone she loved, and had spent 16 years living in the consequences of that choice without complaint. You could hold that and still be angry. They weren't mutually exclusive. Claire drove home. She called her mother that week, not to continue the conversation, not to process anything further, just a call. To ask how the follow-up appointment had gone, to ask about the cat, to talk about the loose step on the porch, which, honestly, should be fixed before something actually happened. Diane sounded not surprised exactly, but careful. The way you sound when you're not sure yet whether a door is open or just ajar. They talked for 35 minutes. At the end, Diane said, "Thank you for staying." Claire said, "Of course." Neither of them said anything else about it. The conversation landed where it landed, which was not at resolution, but at something more durable. Two people agreeing, without announcing it, to try a different distance. There were still things Claire was going to have to sort through. The image of her father, which had cracked and would need to be rebuilt into something more honest. The 16 years, which were real and had a real cost. The anger, which was legitimate and didn't disappear because the facts had shifted. And there was this. A woman who had loved her enough to look bad for it, who had chosen to absorb her daughter's misreading rather than correct it at a cost Claire wasn't asked to pay. Claire hadn't forgiven everything. She wasn't sure forgiveness was the right word for what she was working toward, which felt more like comprehension. Like finally seeing the full shape of something you'd only ever seen part of. The next time she drove up to visit, she brought tools for the back step railing. She didn't announce it. She just showed up with the tools and said she'd seen a video online and it looked like something she could do herself. Diane watched her from the doorway while she worked and didn't say anything particularly, just watched. And after Claire had gotten the railing secure and stood up and tested it, Diane said, "That's good, thank you." "It needed doing," Claire said. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink, and they had lunch. The conversation was ordinary, good even. The kind of ordinary that isn't accidental, that takes work to build, that is built by small decisions made over time about what you're willing to try again. It wasn't everything, but it was real, and it was more than it had been. And Claire drove home that afternoon knowing something she hadn't known before. That the truth, even when it arrives late and complicated and without clean edges, is still better carried together than alone. She called her mother the following Sunday, and the one after that. Not because everything was resolved, because some things don't resolve so much as continue, and you decide what you want to do while they're continuing. And what Claire had decided, finally, was that she didn't want to spend any more time at the wrong distance. If this stayed with you, if you thought of someone while you were watching this, take a moment and leave a word or two in the comments. You don't have to explain it. Sometimes just acknowledging that something landed is enough. Take care of yourselves and of the people who are harder to take care of.